Thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. We'll get started very shortly. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar today on Agile adoption in open banking. I think certainly across Asia, when we look at the development of the financial markets over the past couple of years, the idea of APIs and open banking has really taken hold, driven initially by what we saw in Europe, now increasingly across Asia and countries like India, Australia, Singapore. The development of APIs and open banking has really changed the nature of financial services. Today, Capron Asia is proud to be presenting this webinar in collaboration with Red Hat and Intel, looking at the details around what's happening in APIs and open banking. Over the course of the session today, we'll take a look at some of the key challenges that banks are facing, some of the key opportunities of moving into APIs and open banking in Asia, and where we're going in the future. We're also happy to have Idea Inc. with us, who will be illustrating discussion points that we go through during the webinar today. Our speakers today come from Red Hat. We have Roy, who's the head of FSI Industry for Asia Pacific, and also from MindGate, Chris, who's the head of innovation. So let's get right into it. And I wanted to start off with you, Roy. I mean, to kind of set the stage of where we are in APIs and open banking in Asia right now, where are we in the adoption of APIs? Where are banks in this transition to open banking in Asia?
Right. Thanks, Zenon, to have me, for having me here today. Appreciate to be part of this conversation. So look, when we are talking about API and open banking, see, the concept of API is not new, right? So we have been talking about API for years now, but the primary difference is that the earlier discussions around API had been mostly more internal focused. But right now, the APIs that we are discussing today and the industry in general is more around how we can take APIs and externalize it and standardize it across, and which enables the various services and data to be accessed from bank to the external world. So I think that's where most of the conversation is happening. And of course, it started off with this whole PSD2 initiatives in Europe, and then open banking in UK as well. Now, over the last few years, it has this concept has taken off quite a bit in Asian market as well. But again, some of these initiatives are taking place in different ways. In certain markets, it's very much driven by the regulator, where the regulators have come in with certain policies and certain deadlines in place as well, like the likes of markets like Australia, Hong Kong. But again, even beyond those markets, there are quite strong uptake of open API banking, where the initiatives are more market driven, where the banks are taking the necessary steps to open up their business models and their business architecture to take their services out, out there in the market and create an ecosystem of together with service providers. So, of course, a lot of these initiatives are also supported by the regulators. But, if you look at markets like Singapore, you have got initiatives happening in Philippines and other parts of ASEAN market as well, where, yes, the API initiatives are being taken up quite aggressively, but primarily driven by the industry in general.
It's interesting, the bifurcation between market-driven versus regulatory-driven. Roy, sticking with you on that, I mean, just to get into the nitty-gritty of this, I mean, when you look at some of these external usages of APIs now that we're seeing across Asia that you mentioned, I mean, what are some of the key challenges that banks are facing, and how are APIs helping them overcome those challenges?
Right. I think that's a pretty interesting question. Look, see, banks are moving in that direction for sure. Right. So most of the conversation that, I've been in the technology space for a long time. right? And earlier when we were trying to talk to banks, the conversation was more around how they can do everything internally. And how easy is the system in doing, creating new capabilities, new features, and create new services. But over the last few years, that conversation has definitely shifted, where the discussion is that why do it internally, rather how I can open up my platform and collaborate with others, right? So that is becoming a key driver when a business or even a technology conversation is happening right now. But then again, when banks are talking in that direction, it is not because they want to do it because they just are excited about it. But how it came along is more about a compulsion to be more customer focused, and a compulsion compulsion and the need to connect to the customer's life journey, right? And one thing they have realized, based on various market developments and factors around it, and a lot of fintech players that have come in, is that if they have to connect to a customer's life journey, it need not be only looking at some key milestones in a customer's life. They have to start connecting with the customers in addressing their day-to-day challenges, their day-to-day problems. And to do that, they have to come up with new services, and also to connect their services in multiple other third-party players' ecosystem, which means that they have also realized that they cannot, in the present context, play all the roles in the value chain of a customer's need cycle. So, which means that they cannot be the one designing or manufacturing and also distributing, right? So, what API banking has done is enable the bank to to basically break their services into smaller components. And if I try and borrow a term from the technology industry, if it's like microservicization of a bank's business, where breaking their individual their services into smaller components, and then enabling the bank to take those services and connecting it to various other chains or other value chains that are there in the market, which means that sometimes they can play the role of a distributor, or become a distribution channel for another third-party services, or become maybe the payment settlement provider, or even create certain services which they can give it to somebody else. So basically enabling them to take their services into small components, and taking them out in the market and plugging them with multiple other ecosystem partners. I think that is what really, if I put it very simply, an API banking is really enabling the banks to do.
It's really interesting. I mean, a lot of what you said is kind of pointing the complexity of the ecosystem. I mean, I think when we look at what's happened here in Asia, especially with China, I mean, finance is one part of a super app. And along with that, you have connectivity into ride hailing and wealth management and payments and multiple different financial and lifestyle choices in one app. So that connectivity is really important. Chris, I want to come to you. I mean, you at MindGate, you see this across the region. But I mean, what are some of the key challenges that you're seeing from banks? Is that very similar to what Roy was mentioning?
So I just want to take on a few things as to where also what is driving this in a large way from an API banking perspective is, once this API banking is kind of available in the market, we've got large merchants, large institutions, which have three basic asks from the banks, and that's what the banks are trying to be the front or the first in the market to kind of provide to them is, can you provide me unique services or customizations the way I want to ideate and capture my market? How fast can you get that going? Second, can you give me a surge in demand if I have to on demand perspective? And three, can I get granularity of each service so that I can give a better customer experience? Just to elaborate on all the three in a nutshell is, so you've got a lot number of merchants or payment players who are in the market, but everybody wants to create a unique value proposition. If you take a traditional monolithic application, which today most of the banks have in their systems in the financial ecosystem, it evolves a lot. It requires a lot of deliberation and a lot of development and touch points to be looked at before you can say, okay, if I build this service, this does not have an impact on my overall customer base, it's specific to somebody. So that speed to market becomes very important. That's where API makes that differentiation. I could customize that API specifically for those people. Coming to the second point, now we've got a lot of e-commerce platforms and a lot of aggregators who provide large windows where you've got huge transactions coming in. For example, if you've got a sale, like you've got your October sales going on across e-commerce platforms, the volume of transactions which come out at that point in time is humongous. So then assurity from the e-commerce player to say, can you give me that surge in that point in time without having to build an infrastructure which is perennially set up in that nature? So the ability of a container ecosystem to scale up, scale down, to manage that surge makes a very big differentiator for them. And the third point is, because these APIs are so segregated into microservices, it provides a very view and a granular view to an end consumer as to what happened to a transaction in life cycle. And that provides a high level of customer service experience. So anybody who's able to address these three challenges, that's where the differentiation is coming. And from a bank point also, one value add which comes out of this is, since I am providing this value add, I am able to quantify it and monetize this with my consumer. Today you will not able to do that in a monolithic ecosystem. It ends up with an IT service provider building some 100 man hours or 200 man hours, but you will not be able to apportion how much of consumption did I actually give to somebody who asked for it and be able to monetize that. So that's where this adoption is picking up, actually.
Yeah. Now those three buckets it's a great way to categorize it. I mean, Roy, what Chris was pointing at, there's a lot of flexibility and the agility that is needed in a model like that to be able to adapt to all of the new demands, not just from an organizational perspective, but more specifically from a technology perspective. I mean, given your focus at Red Hat, what role do open source platforms play in the development of APIs and kind of the supporting infrastructure for enabling this agility?
Right. Look, I completely agree with what Chris just said, right? So whenever a bank is working in a ecosystem kind of a setup, and they have to be prepared for these three things, right? In terms of there can be continuous changes that comes in terms of new business requirements, new requirements from the consumer side, and also more importantly from the regulator perspective as well, right? So this is becoming the regulation element becomes very, very important, because whenever the customer data is coming into the picture, right? So how you exchange the data, how do you maintain the security, and so on and so forth. So whatever platform that your services are running on, right, has to be capable enough to support an agile way of bringing in new capabilities and new development, and that also includes an API, right? So it is not just about business functionality, because to introduce a new service, there has to be necessary interaction with with the bank system, and the third-party systems might be required. So for that, the necessary API structure has to be in place, which supports that agile way of introducing new capabilities and new kind of APIs. That's one. And also the other factor is that new volumes coming in. That's where the scalability aspect comes in, because it's not just about new volumes, but possibility of coming across sudden surge in volumes that somebody would not have planned from the infrastructure perspective. And also the other element is on the security part. that becomes a critical issue, because whenever customer data is involved. So which means that the underlying platform has to be capable enough in terms of scalability perspective, agility perspective, and the security perspective. And that is where open source comes in quite strong, because that it is, the platform needs to be innovative enough, has to support innovation, and it's the open source which, where you have got not just few thousands of people, but hundreds of thousands of people working together at a global level to come up with innovations to solve some of these problems. And so through open source, organizations and banks have access to these ready innovations on a continuous basis. Where Red Hat comes in is we enable those innovations to be available to enterprise customers through through our internal processes to make these innovations enterprise ready, right? So I think that is where Red Hat connects a bank with the open source in an enterprise ready environment.
Yeah, it essentially provides that basic level of functionality that you can layer everything on top of, and enabling that agility. I'd also like to mention to the attendees of the webinar today, we are of course taking questions as well. So in the functionality of Zoom, there is a Q&A tab. If you do have questions, please do submit them, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of the webinar. Now, Chris, I wanted to come back to you. I mean, at MindGate, you guys are focused on the Indian market, Middle East, and increasingly Southeast Asia. India and UPI, I mean, UPI has to be one of the top 10 financial industry initiatives over the past decade, certainly, and the impact that it's had in India, not just on payments, but in the entire financial industry is difficult to overstate. I mean, when we talk about UPI and the convergence with APIs, I mean, what has UPI done to kind of push along the adoption of APIs in India?
I think first of all, UPI was, when it was incubated, it was essentially talking about real-time payments, right? But somewhere down the line, as people saw the value as it got pushed, and it's been a complete transformation as to who is today driving UPI. If you see from a perspective of today's market, you would see the likes of PhonePe, Google Pay, WhatsApp, which are predominantly not even banks, which are not even payment players, who are actually driving volumes into this market. And if you just go by that, what it has actually done is, in a way, it has opened up banking completely for non-banking players. The ease of with which you can connect to these ecosystems, have an interoperable 24/7 ecosystem. And if you see, they're not only driving consumer side, they're also driving the merchant side. So there is a two-pronged play that they're actually doing. So they're entrenched in the market, not being a banking entity, being a third-party payment service provider, and understanding that you really don't have to be a banking entity to do that, because though there's a lot of legacy things and a lot of other things that a bank actually does, vis-a-vis just driving e-commerce or commerce payments or payments can be some completely segregated. And most of the banks have realized that if you want to drive consumer volume, if you want to have retention, if you want to have a consumer acceptance, then you need to be participating in this ecosystem. You need to be able to scale. You need to provide those same level of services. And gradually we're seeing UPI becoming an incubator for innovative new things coming in. For example, now we're talking about doing KYC on UPI. We're talking about doing credits on UPI. We're talking about doing lending on UPI. So a lot of ecosystem players are now trying to ride on UPI by saying that there is a mechanism and we can build out onto that. And these are people who are actually driving. And apart from the few that I named, there are a lot of OEMs like Vivo, like Realme, who are all predominantly mobile OEMs who've got a large market share in the market today. And they're all people who are also looking at this and say, I have a consumer base which I have, it's captive to me. And why can't I use this platform to monetize? It takes them about 4 to 6 months to get on the platform and start using that. So that's as easy as what you have to do. So essentially, if you look at it, what UPI has done has flipped the concept of people going to the bank, rather than the bank coming to their devices. And people don't associate today with the bank. If today the parlance people says, can you Google pay me or can you WhatsApp pay me? So the paradigm has shifted from knowing a bank to knowing your device or knowing your application that you might have used. So that's been a fundamental shift of how it's going to. And I see that as a great wave. And a lot of countries have looked at it and want to replicate a very similar model. The implementation may be different in terms of how they want to build in their checks and balances, but predominantly they want to get to that stage.
Yeah, I guess once your platform becomes a verb, you know you've made it. Whether it be let me Alipay you, let me Google Pay you, let me WhatsApp pay you. I mean, just sticking on that topic, Chris. So I mean, from the customer's perspective, so talking about retail customers and SMEs in India, and what are the differences that they have noticed because of this adoption? I mean, what does the adoption of APIs and UPI, what does that mean for them, and how would they notice a difference in their daily lives and habits? Chris, yeah. Okay, we'll come back to Chris on that. Roy, I mean, in the context of India, I mean, it kind of raises the question of what this means for the banks themselves. And you talked about in different parts of Asia, you know, you have some that's market driven and some that's regulatory driven. What does this mean in terms of revenue or cost savings for the banks and financial institutions? I mean, is that a question? Is this a new source of revenue or is it cost savings? What is the role of this in the banking system, not just in India, but in general across Asia?
Right. So look, I think this whole concept of this API banking or open banking, you know, I think it does both. One is on the revenue side as well as on the cost side. On the revenue side, because it opens up various different new services and ways to connect to the customer, and that creates new business opportunities with them, and which banks were not really looking at. And also, what is more important is that it creates, you know, when I started. And at the beginning of today's session, I mentioned that the banks are doing this in an effort to connect to a customer's life journey. So what is becoming more and more important is that through the API banking, as this data and the customer data is being moved around, the banks are also getting better visibility of the customer's behavior, which enables them to become a static service provider where they are creating something and putting it in front of the customer and expecting them to come and consume it. They are now moving themselves from a static banking to a more of a behavioral banking model, where they can then start contextualizing their services or their partner services, ecosystem partner services, to the specific requirement of the customer when they really need it. And that increases the possibility of uptake of that particular product more. Okay, so that creates a strong revenue opportunity for the bank, and also it impacts on the cost side as well, because one simple example is on the onboarding process itself, because I think that has that itself has significantly reduced how the process that a customer has to go through to get onboarded, and the time it takes, and which naturally impacts the underlying cost that is there for the customer. So I think it has multiple impacts that a bank is seeing right now from their top line perspective as well as their profitability perspective.
Interesting. Chris, we lost you there just for a second, but it ties in well with what Roy was just saying. I was just asking, what is the impact of the API adoption and UPI on SMEs and retail consumers in India? I mean, how would I have seen a difference as a customer of one of the banks?
I think a lot of fintechs and a lot of paytechs have now got into this ecosystem, understanding that APIs are available. And finally, you've got a lot of banks. You've got 120 plus banks today in the UPI ecosystem. Which bank do I partner with? If you look at that paradigm today, there's probably about a handful of 4 or 5 banks that everybody wants to kind of go back to. And again, it boils down to those three things. How agile is the bank in giving me these services? How their capability to scale up and scale down on that, and their appetite to innovate with me in terms of providing me customization services. So these three paradigms actually are driving them from that perspective. But yes, the adoption is there. A lot of innovation is happening about creating those models. And also from a bank side, when I look at it, today the larger banks which have been there because of the dominance that they've got in the market and the market presence, they also want to capture this market because they understand that these are not things they would build. These are not things that they would essentially think about and build as a banking ecosystem perspective, but they would definitely extend services like lending, like credit, like a lot of those things, which the fintechs can actually ride on and use that ecosystem that they've got to kind of expand the market, because there is only so much a bank can do in terms of generating those customers. They have their own limitations, their regulations, the RBI regulations or any central bank regulations, which are part of their ecosystem. They've got a lot of other things to kind of manage. And these are the arms which are actually driving them in that ecosystem. So an adoption on real-time payments also brings them to a lot of other areas which today traditionally don't happen. For example, last year India launched on UPI, they launched one more initiative. Can I subscribe to IPOs on UPI? That's nobody would have thought about to say, okay, can we do IPO subscription on UPI? And it's been a big success. It's been a learning curve, but it's been a success that eventually everybody's saying, if you can do subscription, why can't you get to trading? So that's the next step which is kind of coming out. So a lot of those building blocks are being ideated, and a lot of those are coming out also because the platform exists and the capability is there. And this is where most of the big banks are now looking to transform from a monolithic application to a pure play microservices Kubernetes kind of an architecture, because these are huge demands. You've got an IPO which probably will bring you around 10,000 transactions per second or 20,000 transactions, but it's a surge in about 4 to 5 days. Now, do I need to provision a hardware for 5 years that I will get an IPO daily, or do I do it on demand? This is the paradigm which a microservices platform kind of solves for them, saying, okay, I need it for 15 days, so the services go up and I can bring it down on demand.
Yeah, that ability to scale is very important in that. You brought up an interesting point about the competition as well. I mean, what we're finding in some of the research that we're doing around this is that in many jurisdictions, you have 3 to 5 banks that own 90% of the retail deposits and a similar amount of the commercial deposits. And for these mid-market banks to compete, a lot of them are looking at API services as ways of innovating around that to remain competitive against some of these larger organizations as well. Chris, I want to stick with you again on this. And what about the challenges for banks in implementing this? I mean, what have you seen be the key challenges for Indian banks as they've been connecting into UPI? Is it legacy infrastructure? Is it organizational challenges? Is it strategic direction? I mean, what are the challenges, maybe at a high level and then a little bit more of a technical level as well? What are some of the technical challenges that they faced?
Sure. So I just want to again break it down into a couple of things which we've seen essentially with this. The first part is this is a fairly new technology which is there for banks. And most of these banks have people who've used legacy technologies, who've done the monolithic or the 3-tier architecture which is there. So the concept of first breaking down into services, how does that kind of work? That is the first challenge that we have to bridge. That's the first part that everybody has that. The second part also is that this new platform, right? So there are a lot of open source to licensed platforms which are available in the market, and typically any bank would want to look at to understand what happens beyond implementation. How do I manage? How do I scale? What is my operational ability to look at this infrastructure and manage it? what is the technical expertise that the OEM brings with the platform in terms of, if tomorrow I have a trouble, if I have to troubleshoot till the minute detail, what kind of skills can I? Because these are not skills today available in the market. So there's a learning curve for the banks to kind of adopt. Point number 3 also is that a lot of these banks have a long-term contracts with a lot of these legacy systems in place, or those hardwares and those OEMs in place. How do I monetize this in terms of getting that to that, and where is my commercial value derived from this perspective? And I think one of the largest challenge which they have is, you can build n number of APIs, n number of new platforms on top of your existing banking ecosystem and provide those APIs. But if you don't have your legacy downstream core banking, your debit cards, your ATM kind of systems also scalable, then there is only so much you can do. So the view that a bank kind of takes is, if I'm going into this API services, then the journey is not only one side. It is not only the consumer facing side. It is not only those platforms, but it's a complete reorchestration of my end-to-end ecosystem of the value chain, from the origination to the destination. And that is where even those vendors are now starting to say, we can give that to you, because that is starting to become a differentiator. I could have my real-time payment platform doing 10,000 TPS or 20,000 TPS with this Kubernetes platform. But if my underlying core banking can only support 100 TPS, then there's nothing that actually brings meat or value to that. Those financial transactions still become a bottleneck. And so most of the banks have looked at it holistically to say, this journey requires us to transform the way banking is done. We want to look at it as a service where we can monetize each service, scale them, and have the ability to manage them as a service rather than a monolithic construct.
Mm-hmm. It's a completely different mindset than I think what a lot of them are used to. Roy, coming back to you, I mean, looking at your remit across Asia Pacific, I mean, you're obviously familiar with everything that's happened with UPI and APIs in India. And you brought up the point of regulatory driven versus market driven. And I think the initial thinking in Europe with PSD2 was that, okay, we're forcing open banking on the banks, and the banks saw it as a negative. With a market driven approach where it's not actually required, do you see this being successful in Asia? I mean, when you have certain jurisdictions, as you mentioned, like Hong Kong and Australia, they're mandating it through regulations. What about the market-driven side of things? I mean, will we see the same kind of innovation that we saw in India around UPI, or is that just a special use case that we won't see in other markets?
Sometimes, quite honestly, sometimes the regulation helps, right? So it regulates institutions to move in a particular direction. And the good thing about when we're talking about API banking here, unlike a lot of other new initiatives, I think central banks have been quite open-minded in this, specifically in the Asian context, right? So they are quite open-minded in terms of encouraging encouraging banks to go out and start collaborating with fintechs and create business opportunities, and then support those initiatives with specific policies, maybe not always in form of regulations and strict regulations and timelines, but it has worked so far, right? So which has seen a lot of surge in new innovations coming up in the market, and banks are then aggressively going in and partnering with these innovations, and also coming up with the new innovations. The difference between what a lot of other markets have done and what India has achieved, I feel, is how India has gone about doing it. Now, when we are talking about open banking, normally it's the European initiatives around PSD2 or UK initiatives around open banking that comes at the top of everybody's mind, and that keeps the coming up in a lot of the conversations. But I personally feel that the UPI initiative and the India initiative, the so-called India Stack, that it's known as, is doesn't come in that often in conversation in context of the global open banking initiatives. But in my opinion, it is one of those initiatives that has been successful and have created tangible benefit in people's lives. And one of the reason behind it is that what it has been primarily not just that the government came up with some policies, but they took the initiative to create that infrastructure in place. So they went and created this Aadhaar system. They then created these this whole this consent model, how this how this consent model is managed in this UPI ecosystem. So all these things, and then how data then travels from these multiple systems seamlessly to achieve end-to-end transaction flow, right? And for that, they opened up the platform through APIs through which the external parties, both banks and non-financial institutions, non-banking institutions connect to them. So I think what India had done, and the success of UPI has primarily been where the authorities had taken that initiative and created that underlying infrastructure, and then opened it up, that infrastructure out for innovations to start happening on that. I think I think that's where probably future would start heading, where yes, there will be a lot of innovations that will keep coming up through market initiatives, but somewhere down the line, there has to be some support that needs to come in from authorities beyond just passing some regulations.
Interesting. There's kind of related.
Just to add to what Indranil was saying, what actually made a paradigm shift in terms of UPI adoption, if you look at it, is that the problem that they were trying to solve is, can I empower consumers to do low ticket transactions? And what does that cost involve in doing a low ticket transaction? The idea here is, can I reduce the cash dependency? And when you start solving that paradigm, if you see typically what happened in the first 2 years of transactions on UPI, they would be essentially ticket sizes between 50 to 100 rupees to 200 to, a few would be about 5,000-6,000 rupees, but predominantly this would be the ticket size which would start off coming in. What that did was it made people realize how easy it is to do a transaction. And that created like a field for somebody like the Google Pay and WhatsApp to come in and with their consumer base, just ramp it up to put it in everybody's hand. The immediate, plus that created from something like that was merchants started accepting it. Having a QR, scan and pay, everybody started doing that. And now you see, billers, you see large corporates, you see merchants, everybody coming into this ecosystem and saying, I want to participate because I have a ready consumer base which accepts my electronic mandate, which can do a scan and pay, which can do everything for me. I don't have to build anything. I just have to plug into this ecosystem. So I think it was a top-down approach of how they wanted to solve. Get the consumers, get them ready, get them comfortable using the platform. That automatically created the demand on the merchant and the corporate side to say, now we need to leverage this and monetize this. And these are the guys who are actually paying now for the platform because they're ready to pay for this because the cost of transaction is phenomenally low now. That's the point of it. It's real time. So, everything is there for them.
Got it.
And sorry, if I may, yeah, just to add to that, right? Because just to give you an example, that where it's the initiative that was taken by the by the central body who started putting together this infrastructure in place, certain innovation which really was one of the key factor in moving taking this UPI forward is this whole mechanism of consent, right? Now in the whole concept of open banking, if you look at it, this consent element plays very important part because in the traditional financial services concept, a consent has, for a fund to move from one point to another, the consent has to generate from where the fund is residing, right? But in open banking concept, the consent is the concept of this consent is turned upside down, where a consent can get initiated from a point where the fund is not residing. So a third party fintech then can initiate a transaction and then go to the customer's account and, with customer's approval, and pick up the fund and move it from here, right? What UPI has done and has taken it further, where it said that, okay, you can initiate the consent with a consumer's own physical self. And what do I mean by that is with Aadhaar, which is the Aadhaar, which is the central ID for citizens in India or residents in India, you can initiate using your own ID or using Aadhaar, which means that you can use your thumbprint and initiate a transaction, right? And if you look at it, it might look very, very simple, but sci-fi movie that we used to see when we were children, where you are converting yourself as the authorizing device. So which means that a person who might not have a mobile phone, because mobile phone is a very common thing we talk about, right? That how we can push services through mobile. But in case of UPI, you can actually do a transaction even without a device, as long as you have your own self, your own body in place, right? So some of these simple innovations came up with the underlying structure that was created and then opened up to the external world.
That innovation, yeah. There's a question from the audience that kind of ties into that, and Roy and Chris, you kind of both hinted at this in your talk. I mean, there was a lot of talk about WhatsApp Pay and Google Pay and the fintechs. Ben from our audience has a question about, does this put the fintechs at an advantage over traditional financial players? I mean, arguably, when you look at the fintechs, they tick a lot of the boxes in terms of being a little bit more digitally agile. Does that mean that they are going to, that payments, as an example in India, UPI payments will be on kind of third-party digital wallets, or do the banks still have a chance in this? What does this mean for the competitive landscape? Maybe we can start with Chris on that.
See, I think one of the things which UPI has fundamentally changed in India is that people don't nowadays look at bank as an option to pay. They look at devices, they look at applications as options to pay. That's essentially a fundamental shift in what people have in terms of that. Yes, bank is where I trust to keep my funds, but I don't need to go to a bank to do a payment, or I don't need to go to a bank to do a collection. That fundamental shift in mindset has already started with, that's what I said when we were discussing, right? People today say, can you Google Pay me? Can you send me on WhatsApp? So nobody asks, where's your bank account? Which bank do you bank with? So that's actually fundamentally starting to shift. But does that take out financial players? No. They are the core for what is being given today. Any innovation a fintech can do in terms of services, finally, the underlying value of account, underlying value, and the services which a banking can provide cannot be provided by a fintech. A fintech can actually take those services, re-engineer them, make them attractive, and get more consumers. So I look at it as a more symbiotic relationship between a fintech and a bank, rather than a competitive relationship. The bank would still remain an anchor to create financial products. But how do I make it more sellable, the cost of it, how do I retain the customer? That's where a fintech or a social media kind of an app, which has got a large consumer base, will continue to evolve with that and be relevant.
Roy, would you agree with what Chris was saying in terms of competition?
Yeah, I think Chris is bang on, and that's my sincere belief as well. That what UPI or open banking or API banking, what it is really doing is it is democratizing the innovation, right? It is enabling others outside the conventional boundaries of financial ecosystem or financial services system to go and innovate and try out new things and start delivering the services, right? And But at the same time, whenever we are talking about financial services and money, there is a big thing about trust, right? And it is still, whatever said and done, even in today, in today's world, still banks are uh, are considered to be one, trusted entity when it comes to putting money, right? And in terms of handling money. So what I see is happening is innovation is happening around the ecosystem, and those ecosystem players are then would be collaborating with the banks, and the banks would also be collaborating with them, where these fintechs and ecosystem players would be leveraging on the trust element that the bank has developed over the years, while the bank connects to these ecosystem players to leverage on their innovations to deliver and make themselves relevant to the end customer.
Right. Right.
I just wanted to add one more point to this. When you look at why this becomes so critical to understand, that is, see, if it's me and you, we traveling, right? So if I'm going to say Southeast Asia, I'm going to Singapore, I'm going to any of the Southeast Asian countries. If I have an option to say I can pay by WhatsApp or I can pay by WeChat or Google Pay, that abstracts my complete banking and financial ecosystem from whom I'm paying in a third party country to vis-a-vis opening my debit card and handing over in a third party country. That kind of comfort, and if you see, that is where the symbiosis comes. For a bank in India or a bank in any country to outreach to outside its geography and to have regulations and things like that, to kind of go beyond that to do a payment, vis-a-vis somebody like a fintech who's involved, who's already invested in it, who's creating that ecosystem, that's where the symbiosis actually starts to become more and more relevant. And it's happening. If you look at Middle East, right? If you, the example that you gave me, WeChat, right? So Chinese consumers can actually use WeChat to pay in Middle East, right? Today it's already operable. I don't have to have dirhams and things to pay. I can use my WeChat account to pay in Middle East. So if you see, it brings a level of comfort. I can go outside my country, just carry my phone and or any device that I'm an electronic device, and I can actually use that for payments.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, that portability is an important part of this. I wanted to shift kind of, we've got about 10 minutes left now in this panel. I want to shift to looking to the future. And we have another question from the audience that really kicks this off well, is how has the current new normal impacted the uptake of APIs? I mean, when we think about COVID and the pandemic, we think about how that's affected the retail consumers and the SMEs in the market, but specifically around APIs, I mean, how have you seen that change demand and uptake in both of your market views? Maybe we can start with Roy on this.
Well, I think this whole COVID thing has changed a lot of lot of things around us, right? So I think in the current situation, we see that our lives are moving more and more digital, right? Because our apprehension towards having physical interaction with with people we don't know, or getting things venturing outside too much. So that is making our life more virtual, more digital. And that is resulting in us consuming a lot of new types of services digitally. And that is, and for every services that every service that we're consuming, a lot of it, there is a monetary transaction that is there in place, right? And I think that is where financial services institutions are trying to connect to, that how I can connect to every specific activity and event that is going on in a customer's life on a day-to-day basis. And because a lot of these activities are now moving digital, and customers in general who were not typically doing transactions digitally and were doing cash transactions still, and specifically in the emerging economy, is now also because of health reasons and health concerns, they are also getting more and more comfortable doing transactions, through wallets or through digital money. So that's where the digital ecosystem is becoming more important than ever. And to connect to that, institutions and financial institutions have to look at APIs, right? That's there is no way around it.
Mm.
But again, just to resonate further to what Krish had mentioned earlier, that when we are talking about opening up their platform and connecting to various of these external services to make themselves relevant, it's not just about the external APIs that we're talking about. We are also talking about these internal APIs that is not really talked about much in a lot of these conversations, because at the end of the day, whatever services that you're delivering to the external world is you're doing it through collating and picking up data from various disparate systems that is residing inside the bank, right? And some of them are residing in different kinds of technology. So whenever we are talking about agility from that external layer perspective, we should also look at agility and the scalability from the internal integration points as well, right? Because unless you can support the volumes that is coming from that external world into your internal system, and then in servicing those requirements effectively from the data lying from different systems, your services will fail, right?
Yeah.
So, and that is where Red Hat has been, and Red Hat has recognized that as an organization, and that's why we have been focusing a lot of our discussions with our clients accordingly, where it's our whole story around containerization and our API layer and integration layers. It's all about how we can, and enabling the customers to go and open up their system and work in an ecosystem environment. It's a lot around both external and internal capabilities that can be built.
Yeah, yeah. Krish, I mean, what are some of the changes that you're seeing in both in what banks are looking for and what end customers are looking for?
I think COVID actually brought one paradigm shift. I think is more and more people wanted to be contactless. That's been the biggest shift, that nobody wants to use cash. Even if you see cards, we don't have so much contactless cards in India today. So the fact that I have to put it into a POS or dip it into a POS, these are all aversions which people have started to have. And QR, static QR has been a big pickup in this country now with COVID coming into place. And if you see with the rails of UPI available, it's become fairly easy and low cost for a bank to onboard the smallest of the merchants. So we're seeing people who sell on food carts to vegetable vendors, everybody getting on UPI, having a static QR from either the fintech or from the bank, and it's just a scan and pay. Everybody is doing that. And these are low ticket items, but the simple fact that it's been adopted, it's been accepted, and both sides have an acceptance, that will not change for quite some time, because more and more people realize that I don't have to take out cash, I don't have to do anything, I don't have to pick up my card and do it, because even in fuel pumps, we're seeing that where you do transactions today where you dip in your card, people are averse to that. So we see fuel pumps also having QRs, displayed prominently where you can scan and pay. And because it's real time, the guy at the last mile person at the merchant level who's actually delivering gets a confirmation of the credit to that account. So that fundamentally has made it as an acceptance point. And with COVID and the way it is happening, people's aversion to touch anything, I think this is just picking up, and it's not going to go back, because once it becomes a lifestyle choice, everybody is just doing that. If you see today, the max used interface is scan and pay. everywhere that you see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing that shift. I lived in China up until a couple of years ago, so I was using Alipay and WeChat Pay on a regular basis. And I remember one week looking at my wallet and saying, wow, I have 1,000 renminbi in my wallet at the beginning of the week. And at the end of the week, I had 1,000 renminbi in my wallet. And I said, wow, I really, I've gotten good with my finances. But little did I know that I had already spent about 3,000 renminbi outside of cash, just in a digital ecosystem. And that's, for certain countries like China and India, it's an incredible shift away from cash for two countries that were historically very cash driven. Certainly.
Yeah, I think one more thing is also, Zenon, we need to understand that the mindset is not changed from a consumer side only. It's also changed from the small to very small merchants, For somebody who's running a cash driven kind of an economy that they run in terms of procuring and selling, when they start accepting, even there is an acceptance that their sellers or the larger retailers from where they buy, even there the acceptance has become digital. So the transformation, if you see even in small pieces, though we see from a consumer perspective, it's actually transforming right through those value chains all the way to the largest retailers and the largest corporates, because everybody's going digital on that chain now.
Yeah, increasingly digitized across the B2B all the way down to the Kiranas, I guess they're called in India. We're kind of running out of time here on the webinar, but I just want to wrap it up with one last question for both of you. And maybe we'll start with Roy on this. I mean, what needs to happen to increase the uptake of APIs, or do we need to focus on it at all? Will it just be that you need to adopt them to become competitive and remain competitive in the market? What do you see happening over the next 2 to 3 years in this space?
Look, I don't think this is going to go away, right? So this is the future. This is the direction that the financial services industry will move towards. But what probably will change is, right now, there's a lot of, whenever we are talking about APIs and, opening up their platforms and creating more APIs, it sometimes it's feels that it has become like a race that, which bank will launch how many APIs. Okay. So it's more about how many services we want to open up, and then, get as many ecosystem players coming and consuming it. But then what we see is that somebody can launch hundreds of APIs, but only few gets consumed really. So the utilization would not be that significant. So I think that I see changing, and things will get a bit more rationalized, where we would be talking about more from the perspective of looking at an API initiative, not purely from the technology perspective, but more from the end customer perspective, because I think it's the end customer that often gets missed out in some of these conversations, because what ends up happening is it's all about API around technology, and then the ecosystem player. But how each of these APIs that are being introduced is going to impact the customer's consumption behavior, I think that needs to be factored in, and I guess will get factored in as we move in this journey over time, in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of a bank's API initiatives, and how the KPIs are structured as well, in terms of for this particular business line in itself.
Great. I think we may have lost Krish, but we're running towards the end of time that we have for the webinar anyway. So thank you, Roy, and thank you, Krish, for your time today. I think this was a really interesting conversation and deep dive into adoption and open banking here in Asia. Not only are we doing this webinar, but also with Red Hat, we're doing a white paper looking at this very similar topic and diving into a little bit more detail around the actual implementation challenges from a technical perspective around APIs. So we'll be sure to distribute that to everybody who was on the call. As well, we had many questions that came in the background. Unfortunately, we just didn't have time to answer all of them. We will, however, follow up after the webinar with emails to you to answer the questions that you had if we didn't have time to get to them on this webinar today. So thank you again to our panelists and to our audience. We hope it was educational for you, and we look forward to seeing you on a webinar again in the future. Thank you.